Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today is February 16th, which is National Do a Grouch a Favor Day. My name is Keith Wojcicki. I'm a Managing Director and Global Head of Threat Intelligence for Kroll Cyber, and I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce today's briefing. At Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight into great value to our clients and help them defend the organization against the latest cyber threats, and really we're trying to improve their cyber maturity. So before we get started, I really want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded, and you will receive the recording the next few days after the session. We are using, as you know, the GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and our presenters will address those questions at the end. So to kick things off, for those of you who are not familiar with Kroll, I just want to take a moment to outline what role that Kroll plays in the cybersecurity marketplace. Kroll is in a very unique position where we deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. Kroll carried out about 3,200 incident response engagements in 2021, and nearly 800 of those were just in this past quarter. We're going to hear more about what we've seen in Q4 today. We do have a wealth of experience with over 550 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes and varieties of industries. And we work with about 60 or so cyber insurance carriers. This gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on the front lines. Today, we'll be taking a look at the current trends that our threat intelligence team has been seeing in Q4 of 2021. We also include the latest intel on what activity there has been so far in 2022. In this session, we're going to cover how we have seen a massive rise in incidents where 0 days or fresh announced CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, were the initial infection vector. We'll also look at the continued dominance of ransomware and how 86% of ransomware cases associated with the double extortion tactics. Now, if that doesn't get you pumped up, then the fact that Lori and George will discuss some of the interesting activities of threat actors we've investigated, to include phishing attacks by Emotet and Dridex. And I did say that right, Emotet's back, and a really interesting case study around email threat hijacking. We are very fortunate, and I'm really excited to have two leading experts joining us today. One is Lori Iacono, and George Glass is the other. Lori is the Senior Vice President at Kroll Cyber Risk. Lori manages the day-to-day operations for the Cyber Threat Intel team, which has many functions throughout Kroll, and it really is included the supporting of incident response engagements. Prior to this, Lori managed the Brand and Consumer Protection Program at the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance, or the NCFTA, that's headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George Glass is the head of applied intelligence at Kroll and is responsible for ensuring that the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to proprietary XDR platform used to power our managed detection and response services to clients around the globe. And before joining Kroll, George had a background working across the defense, finance, and e-commerce sectors in the UK. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori, who gives us more insight into threat landscape at the end of 2021. Lori?
Thanks, Keith. So as Keith mentioned, I do manage the day-to-day of our threat intelligence team at Kroll. And our threat intelligence team, we do a lot of different functions, but we look at a lot of different data sources to derive our threat intelligence. And some of our sources are dark web sources, so specifically looking at what's happening in forums or marketplaces. We also look across general open source reporting that we're seeing online, and then we also look across, as he mentioned, our incident response cases, or sometimes call them IR cases. And these are active cases where someone has had some kind of an incident or an event, and they've called Kroll to conduct the forensic examination or to help them contain that event. And as we look through that data, what we started doing was, looking at the data for a given quarter and trying to see if we could tease out any themes or kind of a narrative for that given quarter. And we've been doing these for a few quarters now with our clients. And sometimes at the end of these sessions, people will say, okay, like, you really scared us here, because there's a lot out there, and there is on a daily basis with cyber. But the goal isn't to scare everybody, but it's really just to kind of help you guys see some of the real activity that we're seeing, and hopefully that will help you with, if identifying any gaps or weaknesses in your coverage, or helping you assess areas where you may want to prioritize for your business. So that being said, I'm going to go into the story, so to speak, of what we saw for Q4. So this slide here is looking at our incident response cases by sector, by ransomware variants that were observed, as well as by initial access. So for the sectors that we were most seeing targeted in our reported cases, the professional services sector was the #1 sector that we were seeing. And that sector, or that category, we kind of use that as a bucket term, and it includes many different categories such as insurance, legal, accounting firms, staffing solutions, things such as that. So they fall into that professional services category. And unfortunately, we have seen that sector targeted a lot in our cases over the past year, in fact. We also see, rounding out the top 5 there, we see technology and telecommunications, healthcare, manufacturing, and the financial services sector being targeted, like I said, in our casework. As far as ransomware variants, I'm not going to touch on that too much here because we're going to talk a lot about that later in the session, and we're going to do a kind of a deep dive into spotlighting ransomware. But I do want to talk about initial access. This is probably, I would say, one of the most common questions that we get from clients or counsels or insurance carriers is, how are the threat actors getting into systems? So based on our assessments with some of the reporting that we get back from our incident response examiners, some of the most common ways that we're seeing that are leading to events, phishing is usually #1. And then we are also seeing the exploitation of CVEs. So common vulnerabilities and exposures. So these are those, software vulnerabilities that we see publicized out there. And then unfortunately, once some kind of a zero-day exploit is available, we are definitely seeing threat actors leverage those. We also, in the Q4, we did see a lot of events come in, what we would call third-party vulnerabilities or supply chain attacks. And in most of these, we were seeing them come in from some kind of IT managed service provider that would hit the MSP, and then there would be a downstream effect to some of our clients, unfortunately. So we're going to go in the next section and talk specifically about initial access. As I mentioned, this is one of the frequent questions we get. So when we talk about those software vulnerabilities or the zero-day exploitation, we actually saw a really big increase from Q3 to Q4. So in Q3, that was only reported in about 6% of our cases. And we looked in Q4, we were seeing it about 27% of our cases were reporting that as an initial access method by actors. So that was essentially how these actors, like what the actors were doing, they were leveraging these vulnerabilities to get into a system. Now, even at 27%, that still wasn't, that still was next to phishing, which was the #1 in that sector, but we did see a slight decline for phishing in the Q4. So what do we think led to that dramatic rise in the number of CVE or zero-day exploitation? Well, this is a story we've been following all year long when it comes to CVEs, and it's actually been a record-breaking year for these CVEs. I think in the Q1 alone, there was a 3 to 5 week period that we had noted. I think there were 6 to 7 different high-level critical severity CVEs that had happened. And over the year, that's just kind of intensified throughout the year. We've seen more and more of these reports. And there was some analysis that we did at the end of Q4. And essentially, not only was it a record-breaking year, but there were more than 50-some CVEs published on any given day in 2021. So this kind of just shows the challenge for organizations to prioritize that level of patching when you're getting that many vulnerabilities that are coming in. So some of the things that we see threat actors going after are applications related to virtual private network or VPN. We also see them trying to exploit things like cloud-based tools, as well as things that people might use for enterprise management. So in the Q4, some of the common ones that we were seeing in our cases or being reported in our cases were things like Manage Engine, Proxy shell, which is related to Microsoft Exchange. We were also seeing VMware and SonicWall applications being exploited. For Manage Engine specifically, there was an FBI report in the fourth quarter as well that there was actually some APT activity associated with the exploitation of that particular vulnerability. And that is sometimes, unfortunately, something we see with those APT groups taking advantage of these critical severity CVEs. So, you know, some of the ones I mentioned here, like Log4Shell was published in Q4, but some of the ones on the list, like Proxy Shell and SonicWall, they were actually happened, you know, earlier in the year. But what we see with threat actors is they're very opportunistic. They're looking for those unpatched systems. There was a report from CISA, I think it came out in September or August of this year, about the top 20 vulnerabilities. And many of the ones on that list that are still being exploited are ones that patches were out for them as far back as 2017 or 2018. So it just shows that unfortunately there are still legacy systems that might be running these, and threat actors know that, and they are looking for them, unfortunately. So one of the big ones, like I said, for Q4 was Log4Shell. And this one was published on December, I believe it was published in November, but it was kind of publicly announced more in December 10th time range. And when this came out, it was particularly egregious. And I'm going to hand it over to George to kind of talk through this particular one and what we saw in relation to it.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Yep, I'm sure many of you on the call will remember Log4Shell for ruining your Christmas. It certainly took a pretty significant chunk out of mine. The vulnerability itself, as Laurie quite rightly said, was sort of publicly disclosed in December of last year. However, the vulnerability itself had existed for quite some time prior to that, I think back until 2016. I'm not going to go into too much technical detail about the vulnerability because that could be a webinar in and of itself, to be perfectly honest. But the main flaw stems in the JNDI, or the Java naming directory interface, which can call on many other functions to basically query certain things, or to support additional logging within the Log4j application. And as an attacker, this gives you a great many options for exploiting this vulnerability. You could ask for the engine to perform a DNS lookup. This is commonly done to validate whether a system is vulnerable or not, but you could equally use similar tactics to exfiltrate environment variables, tokens, keys. You know, think about AWS access tokens, plain text passwords stored in configuration files. So, you know, and a successful exploit of any host with Log4Shell, you should consider all of the environment variables totally compromised. We also have lightweight directory access protocol, or LDAP. Again, this is a really useful tool for an attacker to maybe request a malicious Java class to be downloaded and executed, giving code execution. Similarly, for remote method invocation, these methods could be chained together, giving rise to a lot of people wondering whether this vulnerability was wormable. And indeed, if you have, say, a web front-end application that is using the Log4j library, maybe back-office systems could equally be impacted by that after a piggyback off that sort of initial compromise. So all of these things, plus the ubiquity of the attack the library, it's pretty much everywhere. It's probably not going to show up in many bill of materials. Meant that this was a really nasty one, very easy to exploit towards the end of last year. And with many things, if a piece of software is looked at by enough people, there's going to be more vulnerabilities found. And I'm sure you all remember the spate of proof of concepts that came out, and the number of different patch versions that came out the following month or so. So what sorts of incidents are we seeing? Well, much of it appears to be totally automated. Unauthorized access being one of them. Again, this could be very opportunistic attacks where there's sort of a spray and pray approach, and threat actors may come back later to access those systems that they've already breached. We've seen this before with other vulnerabilities, such as proxy logon and proxy shell. Reconnaissance, there's certainly a lot of that going on, checking to see if systems are vulnerable. And again, you could use this to, if you're already in an environment, to pivot to a internally vulnerable Log4j installation. But I think one of the most common things that we're seeing at the moment is crypto mining. As I said before, using the LDAP protocol, download a malicious Java class file and install some sort of Mirai type variant that can perform crypto mining. Now, the final thing I want to say on this is when assessing a threat actor, you should consider what the actor could do, not what they would do. And just because there is a crypto miner installed on there does not mean that that's all there's going to be. The capabilities of exploiting this exploiting this vulnerability, forgive me, is fairly high ranging. So certainly one to consider taking a look at if you have not already. And with that, I'll pass the mic back to Laurie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George. So yeah, I'll add that to the crypto mining. So if a threat actor, if they have the access to a system and they're able to, maybe sell it to or install crypto mining themselves, we know from experience that they will take advantage of that access. We see a lot of times in our ransomware cases that if we look back in the logs preceding a ransomware event, there may have been crypto mining on the network before that went unfortunately undetected. Sometimes the client will actually detect the crypto mining and try to shut them out, and at that point sometimes it seems like they will sell the access, unfortunately, to another cyber actor that may come in with something more malicious. So I mentioned earlier that phishing is the top initial access method that we are seeing in our cases, and I wanted to highlight here two of the different malware campaigns that we observed in the fourth quarter. This screenshot here, this is from a Hijacking campaign. So it's kind of a very evil way for them, for this threat actor group, to try to say happy holidays, I guess. They were actually putting this out kind of mid-December timeframe, subject line employee termination, and they were writing to the employee that they were actually being let go from the company with this attached term letter and Excel spreadsheet. Once open, that spreadsheet would deploy basically Hijacking malware, which is a very kind of long-running and very well-known financial or malware that's aimed at obtaining financial credentials. So another one, like I said, Hijacking, that's kind of a long-running, well-known malware. Another one that we saw again in Q4 was related to Emotet. And Keith mentioned at the beginning, we did see Emotet, and he mentioned we saw it again, right? So at the, one of the themes of Q4 certainly has been, there's been a lot of significant law enforcement action that's been taken against cyber criminals in Q4, as well as even, coming into 2022. And that was really the story, like a story that we kept seeing developing throughout 2021. And it was at the beginning of 2021 when some press releases and announcements came out about basically the dismantling or the disruption of the Emotet infrastructure. And it was, said that would be taken down. I think it was as of April 25th or something like that, that threat would be disrupted or mitigated. So it did, and we did see a period where we were not seeing this kind of activity, but unfortunately it made a resurgence in the fourth quarter, and we are continuing to see that kind of activity into the first quarter of this year. I'm going to let George here talk a little bit more. I know he's more of an expert at Emotet than I am, so I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about what we're seeing specifically from those new Emotet campaigns.
Thank you, Laurie. Yep, Emotet is back. What happened originally is we saw the partnership with TrickBot and Emotet once more with TrickBot infections dropping Emotet payloads sort of around November time of 2021. And since then, through our own collection and open source intelligence, we have discovered that there are 2 active botnets being referred to as Epoch 4 and Epoch 5, both of which are spamming in pretty high quantities, both as part of reply chain attacks and cold call spam. Both of these botnets are experimenting with different ways of creating lures, different types of malicious document, ways of infection, breaking the infection chain, trying to bypass detection, just as we would have seen a year prior. So the experimentation is there, the waves of campaigns are back, and indeed, I think a few weeks ago we saw one of the largest spam waves from Emotet in quite some time. So the threat is very much there. They are certainly back, and with the relationship being proven between Emotet and ransomware activity as a follow-on, it was even more worrying to see that Emotet started to begin dropping Cobalt Strike beacons directly sort of around December time. So as I said, the threat is very much there, and yeah, we continue to monitor it very, very closely. Back to you, Laurie. Thank you.
Thanks, George. So next we're going to go into a spotlight on the threat incident of ransomware. And this is typically, since about 2019, ransomware is typically one of the top threat incident types that we see across our cases. From Q3 to Q4, it does look like there's a slight dip there, but remember that this is actually total percentages of our cases. We actually, as far as numbers go, we actually saw a little bit more ransomware cases in Q4, but we saw some upticks in other areas that kind of pushed the overall percentage numbers down. And one of those upticks I'll mention was web compromise, and that was mostly related to things coming in that were related to the Log4Shell or Log4j. So going back, specifically to ransomware, like we're going to talk a little bit next about some of the variants that we see with ransomware. And particularly in Q4, there was a lot of, I mentioned law enforcement activity earlier and some disruption of some of the very well-known ransomware groups, specifically Revil ransomware gang was disrupted in Q4. And, the way that we saw that happening in our cases was we saw, at the beginning of Q4, we were seeing a lot of activity, particularly with Conti. We continue to see activity with Lockbit. And then starting at the end of Q4, we started seeing upticks around variants which were newer in 2021, or perhaps ones that we hadn't observed yet at all in 2021. So there we saw an uptick in Avos Locker cases, as well as Diavel and Hive cases. Now we did see an uptick in Black Matter cases in Q4, but that was actually one of the groups that ended up also shutting down mid Q4. So that's something we've been, like I said, we look at the ransomware variants every few months or every quarter to assess these kind of trends. And in terms of Conti, I do want to talk a little bit more about Conti and how that particular one is delivered, because George talked a lot about Emotet and Cobalt Strike. And what we see with Conti is it really does seem to use this model. I think they started working very closely with TrickBot in the summer of 2021. And at that time, they adopted this model. Historically, this had been associated with the group distributing Ryuk ransomware. And essentially, it's a first stage phishing attack. So there's some kind of a link or malicious document that someone clicks on, and they will get infected with something. In the recent cases we're seeing, it's either TrickBot, Bizarre Backdoor. Now we're seeing more with Emotet. That infection may linger on the system. If it's not detected, then it will proceed to, the deploying of something like Cobalt Strike on the system, which will ultimately lead to that ransomware deployment. So we're seeing, like I said, this is the tactics, techniques, and procedures that Conti seems to be using most commonly now. And we are seeing a second group, Diavel, that seems to be using that method as well. And it is suspected that it's probably the same threat actor group that distributes both of those ransomware variants. So, talking about that first stage infection, right? So there's the, maybe the trick bot or the bizarre backdoor that gets downloaded onto a system through a phishing email. One of the questions that we've gotten in, presenting some of this previously was, well, do we have some examples of cases where we've caught that precursor malware before it's led to something else? So I'll hand it over to George now to talk about example related to spotting those precursor infections before they lead to something.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Yeah, indeed, we have certainly caught precursor malware a lot of times in the past. This is due mostly to endpoint detect and respond products on the endpoint itself. We can detect the infection chain from the malicious document through to, say, executing certutil to go and fetch a malicious DLL. And so in those cases, that is pretty much the best time to stop that infection, because that is before the threat actor has had time to get hands on keyboard activity. One of the things that we're seeing more recently is the time on target is reducing fairly significantly. And we've mentioned before Emotet directly dropping Cobalt Strike. And one of the threat actors that we got a very good chance to look into very deeply is Conti. We actually were able to read their manual of arms. And one of the things they stress in that is the need to move quickly and escalate privileges, perform lateral movement, and move to a domain controller to deploy ransomware from there. So in terms of detecting this thing, it's certainly the best time is when it's still as a sort of commodity malware on the endpoint before the actors have had the chance to begin the lateral movement stage and the privilege escalation stage. Because as soon as they're on the domain controller, you're sort of minutes away from a ransomware event. So I think one of the key takeaways from this is the deployment of some sort of endpoint detect and response tool to as many users as possible, especially now there's so much remote work and relying on network data is maybe not as sufficient anymore. That's certainly one of the things that I would recommend.
Thanks, George. So next I want to talk, I know I've mentioned several times about law enforcement activity in Q4, and I want to go over some of the things that we saw happening in Q4 related to this. So there was some disruption of the Revol ransomware gang. This has been one of the most notorious ransomware gangs since about I would say like the end of 2019. This group's been active, and they were one of the ransomware as a service groups that really pioneered this model of what we call double extortion. So they use this tactic of, stealing data when they were inside the system, and then as part of the ransom negotiation or the ransom demand, it's not only, saying we'll give you a decryptor if you pay, but companies are also told that if they pay, their data would not be put up on the Revol ransomware site. So in mid-October, the Revol ransomware site went down and you couldn't get to it. There was a lot of speculation at that time on the forums that it may have been another threat actor that had hijacked the site or something like that. But about a week after it went dark, there was open source reporting that it was a coordinated effort with US and international law enforcement to actually disrupt that group. And during that time, there was a lot of, there was some significant Bitcoin seizures, Bitcoin wallet seizures that happened as well. A few weeks subsequent to that, there was the announcement of some action against some of the affiliates related to Revol. So when I mention the word affiliates, these are basically actors who are distributing the ransomware. So it's not the operators of the ransomware group specifically, but it is the actors who are distributing that ransomware on their behalf. So we had action against 2 of them. One of the individuals was indicted. The other individual was actually arrested in Poland. And the individual who was arrested in Poland was actually believed to be the actor behind the Kaseya supply chain attack. And that attack was one that happened on July 3rd. So getting from hands on keyboard on July 3rd to an arrest in November of this year was pretty significant for the community. So subsequent to that, anytime we see law enforcement action, whether it's arrest, whether it's seizure of sites, marketplaces coming down, we always kind of, we monitor the activity in the wake of that, because there's usually some kind of a ripple effect. And in the fourth quarter, we did see kind of a lull in activity. We'll talk a little bit about that next, what we saw in relation to the extortion sites. But one group specifically announced that they were shutting down. This was the Black Matter ransomware group. They announced they were shutting down, and they specifically said in some of their messaging about that shutdown that they were doing so due to pressure, or ongoing pressure from law enforcement. So that was, as I said, that was kind of what we were seeing in the fourth quarter related to law enforcement activity. And, as concerns that ripple effect, the fourth quarter was the first time of 2021 that we saw a decline in what we call extortion sites. So I mentioned before that double extortion tactic of the ransomware gangs. We see that in about 86% of our ransomware cases are associated with these double extortion tactics. Last year, or in 2020, I guess, we were seeing that was in about 40% of cases. So in about a year's time, the use of that tactic doubled. And you can see from the stats here of the new sites that we were seeing in 2021, it certainly seemed like this was obviously becoming a very popular tactic, as literally every quarter we were just seeing more and more of these sites being added. So in Q4, we did see a drop in that. It is likely that was related to the significant law enforcement pressure on some of these groups. And most of the new ones that we did observe didn't come up until the end of Q4. So it may have been, rebrands of previous ransomware variants, or, threat actors kind of waiting to see what was happening before they put up their new data leak store, so to speak. So the next thing we want to talk about is email threat hijacking. And this is actually a specific case study that we observed in the third quarter related to a campaign that was leveraging the proxy shell vulnerability to deliver squirrel waffle malware. So this is kind of interesting. It kind of encompasses 2 of the initial access methods that we talked about earlier. The first being CVEs and zero-day exploitation with the proxy shell, as well as the second part of it was the phishing emails related to delivering squirrel waffle. So in this particular case, we had a client come to us, and the client came to us because one of their customers had come to them and said, we're getting, emails that are coming from your email domain. They look like they're replying to legacy email threads that 2 individuals were legitimately having, but these emails that are coming through contain, a malicious link or a malicious download for squirrel waffle malware. So on the client side, as the client began, or our forensic examiners at Kroll began to investigate that, what they discovered, typically in these kind of cases, we would see some kind of malware on the client side. So we would see something like a quackbot that was actually, downloading the email inboxes and then sending those emails from a remote location. But in this instance, through some research, we were able our examiners identified that the actors were actually leveraging the client's Exchange API to send and retrieve these emails. So there were no indicators of badness on the client side that they would have been able to detect. And it was basically, in this case, it was only this notification from their customers that they, realized that this activity was happening. So as I said, and then on the customer side, they were getting these phishing emails. And unfortunately, when actors use these kind of techniques, it is easier to get past email spam filters because it appears like it's, a legitimate sender coming from a legitimate domain. And we also, because they're using those legacy email threads, it might be more likely that users would click on those kind of links or documents. So I want to have George talk a little bit more about that specific malware that they were trying to deliver via this campaign. George?
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you very much. Squirrel Waffle, fantastic name. I think named by a automated system of Proofpoint, but certainly appeared at a very interesting time in the sort of the commodity malware market, where many sort of initial access malware variants were sort of straining to take over the gap in the market that was left with the destruction of the Emotet botnet. During the period, it's sort of Q3, Q4 last year, Squirrel Waffle came to the forefront with some very interesting sort of obfuscation as a loader / reconnaissance type of malware. In terms of where this thing is coming from and the actors behind it, after some investigation, it was found that the TR botnet, which has typically been used to serve Quackbot or Qbot, was being used to distribute Squirrel Waffle payloads. And indeed, a successful infection would typically lead to, again, either Cobalt Strike or Quackbot or Qbot. So certainly very interesting, novel type of malware, but since the resurgence of Emotet has been relatively quiet. Nevertheless, it could still come back, and it's something that we're keeping an eye out for, but a very interesting period in the commodity malware market. Back to you, Laurie. Thanks.
Thanks, George. So that is the end of our kind of threat part of the session. So I want to summarize what we see as the big stories for Q4 2021. And the biggest one, like one of the biggest ones, was obviously the CVEs. It was a record-breaking year for CVEs. So we see those as being a constant threat. We also see that threat actors are quickly exploiting these type of published vulnerabilities, making it a challenge for organizations to prioritize these. We also see as a theme during Q4 was that in spite of these, significant disruption efforts that were made against some of these, cyber criminal groups and, things such as Emotet and Revil, we see that threat actors, they rapidly evolve to, things that are put in place to, detect them, and they rapidly evolve to try to overcome these mitigation efforts. So we definitely saw that in the fourth quarter. And the example there with proxy shell to Squirrel Waffle, that was just one example of the types of different sophisticated methods that they're using to lure users into clicking on phishing emails or links that may evade typical detection methods. So as I said before, all of this, it seems scary. We don't want you to leave being scared. So I'm going to hand it over to George, and he's going to talk about some of the actions that companies can take to actually protect against the effects of this type of activity.
Thank you. So what can we do to try and mitigate some of the threats that we've talked about today? I think the first one, especially since the rise in the use of CVEs and 0 days, especially considering the time to weaponization of some of those vulnerabilities is falling to the realm of days, if not hours in some cases, is to really conduct a very stringent vulnerability management plan. And Backing this with threat intelligence to understand what vulnerabilities need to be prioritized to be patched is extremely important. Trust me, it's very hard to keep up with all of the vulnerabilities that are coming out every single day, and knowing which ones are being exploited or have the highest likelihood of being exploited is very important. In addition to that, empowering the people that are going to perform the patches to say, maybe we need to tear down this service over a weekend to perform the patches. That's all conversations that need to be had with inside an org, and understand the repercussions of doing so. But it's certainly something that may have to happen. Say a very severe vulnerability comes down the line with exploit code in the wild. Doubling down on the 10 essential controls, definitely including multi-factor authentication, given the amount of business email compromise that we've been talking about today. The compromise of an email address can lead to the compromise of any number of other accounts that particular email uses, of course, with a simple password reset. In addition to email hygiene and security culture training, paying particular attention to the types of threats that we've discussed today, such as reply chain attacks, etc. Proactive measures such as penetration testing and red teaming. This is a great way of testing your patch management skills, understanding if you've done the patches correctly, and if there's other avenues of exploit that an attacker may see that you don't. Consider a managed detection response service. MDR services bake in a lot of the threat intelligence that is gleaned from defending other clients. So a lot of that information and expertise is built into the service. And thoroughly prepared and tested plans. I said this before, I think it's repeating again. Someone I once knew told me, prepare, execute, and vanish. I think that's a really good takeaway from this, is to be prepared, do what you need to do, and return to operation as normal. So with that, I will hand back to Laurie, and thank you very much.
Thanks, George. And I'm actually going to hand it back over to Keith to talk a little bit about the threat landscape report that we've put together.
Yeah, no, thank you, Laurie. Thank you, George. That was fantastic. You know, what Laurie and George talked about today, we have published our Q4 2021 threat landscape report on the Kroll website. So if you want to go into more details of the trends we've outlined today, please read the report. You can find a copy of it on the side in the GoToWebinars handout section, or again, like I said, you can go to the Kroll website to download. So, you know, as we said earlier, you know, we're looking for specific questions if anyone has any questions. So we have a few minutes now to take some of your questions. A quick reminder is to type your questions for Laurie and George now. We've had a couple come in during the session, so I'm gonna start with those. Okay, Scott had a question. How do you protect your organization from becoming a victim of an email threat hijacking campaign? And Laurie, I'll throw that to you.
Okay, thanks, Keith. So I'm going to talk about it from two perspectives. One is becoming the sending organization, right? So in this particular example that we talked about earlier this afternoon, the initial access that they used was the proxy shell vulnerability. So one thing that we would recommend to prevent them leveraging vulnerabilities like this would be some kind of red teaming of email applications to make sure that such vulnerabilities don't exist. Also, with things like proxy shell and proxy logon that were identified earlier in 2021, those were two where patching wasn't enough, because if an actor had got in and leveraged that vulnerability prior to patching, there was a chance that there might be a web shell still active on that system. So you need to combine patching with some kind of remediation to make sure that those web shells were removed. And then I know we got on a previous session of this, we got asked about, like, how can a company look for this kind of activity if they're leveraging the client API? And in the case of our examiners, what helped them find this activity was looking at the IIS and the EWS logs that were associated with the Exchange server. Now, on the receiving side, so for the organization that's receiving the email, things to help prevent this kind of activity. Always having some kind of a spam filter in place. Having something like George mentioned with a managed detection response service that would identify that precursor malware before it develops into something else is important. And also, user education is really key here, and that's key for a lot of the topics that we had in the session today. But especially when it comes to phishing, phishing emails they look legitimate now. They don't look like the old ones that we would think of, like a FedEx or DHL phishing campaign from 5 years ago. They look like it's a legitimate thread between two individuals. So making sure that your users are aware of this increase in sophistication, and also maybe doing phishing assessments or things like that, so that in your organization what is the sophistication of your users as it relates to these type of emails, as well, so that you can assess that. So that's what I would say at a high level about trying to prevent some of that email thread hijacking malicious activity.
Sorry, got mute there. Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions coming in. If I don't get to your questions, we don't get to it, we will respond. We do have your contact info. There are a bunch of questions coming in right now. So one here, and either Lori or George, you can answer this one. Do you recommend pulling bad phishing campaigns from users' email boxes? Lori or George?
Yeah, I can take that one. Certainly, yeah. If you have the capability to do so, and you identify a phishing campaign, and you know all of the domains that it's been sent from, for example, or they all use a similar template or header, certainly just yank it straight out of the user's mailbox, out of sight, out of mind. I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
All right, fantastic here. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll wrap it up here. Would blocking domains be a better mitigating tactic? The Lori or George?
So that's specifically talking about those email campaigns that might be complicated, because if they're coming from an organization that you do business with, you may need to receive those kind of emails. I think that would be easier in the case of where it's coming from a threat actor domain or something like that. So that is one of the things that poses a challenge for organizations in managing against these kind of attacks.
Yeah, you're so right. And then like talk about spook domains, and when it comes to that, a lot of firewall activity, blocking something from the firewall is good. Identifying different types of nefarious websites or even countries. There's different all kinds of mitigating factors you can propose. And Lori, we can send you a list of some information just to be able to have that for you. All right. So as we approach the end of the session today, I really want to highlight the truly unique position that Kroll is and deliver the full end-to-end cyber solutions. So we offer the proactive services and governance and assessment, 24/7 monitoring for organizations and their environments, the global incident response engagements we have been discussing in this entire session, and really to the end, which is the full breach notification service. So any questions, anything you need to know about our services, please feel free to call us at any time. But sadly, it is 2:48 here in the East Coast, and we've run out of time. A really big thank you to Lori and George, and of course, everybody that's taken the time to tune in today. We really hope you found this session informative. As I stated earlier, after the session, we'll send all attendees a recording of today's briefing, so you can revisit any parts of the session you wish to. And I always say this, but to include, my fantastic hosting skills as well. We really appreciate you being online. When you leave the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. Surveys are so important to improve, and so if you could spare a few moments, we'd greatly appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on the session, and it really helps us to prepare for additional sessions and what you want to learn in the future. So once again, thanks a lot for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you soon at one of our future briefings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.